some sense of how that was an appeal to the elephant? Yes? It was almost entirely an elephant appeal? All right. Now we're going to look at shaping the path. So again, this is the part of our psyche that's the willing, that deals with actually doing the behavior. And here again, we have three separate categories. The first is tweaking the environment. So some very interesting research where at movie theaters, the researchers took old, stale popcorn, really old, stale popcorn, and put it in different containers of different sizes and gave it to the moviegoers for free. Said, we're doing an experiment. They said they were doing an experiment that was different from what they were actually doing. And before giving out all the popcorn, they weighed it. And then after the movie, they weighed it. Now, all of the popcorn containers were so large that nobody finished their popcorn. And it was kind of stale. It wasn't really very nice popcorn. But what they found was that the people who had larger containers ate more popcorn. The people who had larger containers ate more popcorn. So we have something called a fundamental attribution error. A fundamental attribution error is where you attribute character traits to a person that are really indicative of their situation. So you could say the people who ate more popcorn were more greedy, they were more gluttonous, they had less sense control, but actually the situation was just that they had larger containers. So many times when people behave poorly, it's simply a matter of their situation and not a matter of their character. And many times, the only thing you have to do to be a change agent is to tweak the environment. Sometimes a very small tweak in the environment will be enough for your whole change. If you couple this with everything we've talked about this morning, you are a much more effective change agent. I mean, when we're thinking about tweaking the environment, we can think about, going downhill, giving people a push, right? Lubricating the machine, putting up signs, right? Have you ever gotten lost just because there was no sign? Who here has ever driven in London? Anyone ever driven a car in London? You've driven a car in London. Have you ever driven in the United States? No, okay. So in the United States, our street signs are all on poles. And they're all at exactly the same height as every other sign. So they're always placed at the same part of the street or sidewalk on a pole at the same height. So if you want to know what street you're on or what street you want to turn on, you know exactly where to look. In London, your street signs can be anywhere, right? Or nowhere. They might be at the bottom of a building wall. Like this high off the ground. So if there's a van or a truck or even a car, it's blocked. And because they can be literally anywhere, you have to take time to try to find the sign, and you're trying to drive your car, which is, of course, a very dangerous situation, and you're quite likely to miss your street. All right, we're going to look at another study. So this was in a college dormitory where students live at a university. So researchers polled the students in the dormitory and asked them who were the saints and who were the jerks. who was most likely to give to charity and who was least likely to give to charity. Do people have their papers yet or not? No, you haven't? Okay, so you will have this written in a paper that you will get shortly. And they identified who was likely to be generous, who was likely not to be generous, according to the opinions of the students themselves. Okay, then they decided to do a charity drive, and they altered the path. So some students received a basic letter announcing the launch of a food drive next week, asking them to bring canned goods to a booth on Trestador Plaza, which was a well-known place. So we're having a food drive, bring cans of food to Trestador Plaza. That's it, in one letter. Another letter said, there's a map showing the space, even though it was very well known, a map showing the spot, a request for a can of beans. Instead of bring a can of food, bring a can of beans, and a suggestion that they think about a time when they'd ordinarily be near Trestador Square so they wouldn't have to go out of their way to get there. Okay? So they should think about a time when they would normally be near Trestador Square, Trestador Plaza, so they wouldn't have to go out of their way to get there. So a map to a place they definitely already knew, a can of beans, and said, think about a time when you're already going to be there. And the other one just said, bring a can of food to Trestador Square. So the two letters were sent out randomly to the Saints and the Jerks. And the students who received the basic letter were not very generous. 8% of the Saints and 0% of the Jerks gave any food donation. With the detailed letter, 42% of the Saints donated and 25% of the Jerks donated. Therefore, you are 3 times more likely to get a food donation from a Jerk with a map than a Saint without one. If we could think about for a moment how many times people tweak the environment to try to get us to do something in particular. An ATM machine that shoots out your card and you have to take your card before you can get the cash. That way you can't accidentally leave your card in the machine. A street sign, a certain configuration of desks which push you to collaborate. Amazon's one-click button. I mean, I remember when I first got my Kindle e-reader, and at first I just put on it through email all my devotional books. So that was pretty exciting that I could email myself a book and it showed up on my Kindle. But one day I decided to buy a book on Amazon for my Kindle, and all I had to do was do one click on Amazon, and 2 minutes later, it was on my device. I was so excited, I wanted to buy another book, like immediately, just to see it happen again. Right? It was like magic. It was like I had Prapti City, you know? So I really felt like that. I'm like, whoa, you know, I got my book in 2 minutes. So they tweaked the environment. Now, often we think that people are not cooperating with our change initiative because they have a bad attitude. But often there's simply something wrong with the path. So there's a story about a company that switched from paper reporting to online reporting, and people were not filling out their reports on time. And they're just, you know, haranguing and harassing and reminding. And then they decided to actually watch people trying to fill it out, and they found out that the directions were unclear. And they had a little wizard, but people didn't like to use the wizard. So if people aren't cooperating, it's good to ask them, why? Watch what they're doing, see what's happening, or ask them, What's the problem? What are you having a difficulty with? I'm sure that there's many situations like that where we give up on doing something because the path is too difficult, right? You try and you try and you try, and it's like, this just isn't working right. I can't get it to work. And then just, okay, I'm not going to do this. And many times this is the case with a change initiative. I had a situation, I was working with a group of devotees in ISKCON, and the leadership wanted the group to fill out certain forms in a certain way, and the group didn't want to do it. They said, we have our own way of doing things, we don't want to do things this way. And I went to the management and I said, look, these people are all experienced in their service, they've been doing this service 10, 20 years, they have a way they want to do it, but as soon as I ask them to do it your way, everything just stops. And the leader said, just tell them they have to do it my way. I said, then I quit. So I quit. So that's, often we're thinking like that. Just, force it through, push it through, harangue people without finding out from them what is the problem. I head up the Shastric Advisory Council to the GBC, and one of the things we struggle with is finding a collaborative platform that everybody is comfortable with. So one of our former members pushed using a wiki platform, but it was very, very difficult for people to understand how to use the platform. And I had like half of the members who wouldn't contribute because they didn't know how to use the platform and they weren't comfortable with it. So then we switched to Google Docs. That made it a little bit better, but I still had people who just, it doesn't work this way, I lose my formatting, and people who just couldn't even understand what button to push. And so you had people who weren't participating because the path wasn't clear for them. And it's important to remember that what's clear for me might not be clear for somebody else. Something that I just say, I just know how to use this, it's intuitive, I get it quickly, especially if I design the path. That may not be the case for somebody else. This is a really fascinating bit of research. So in most hospitals, it's the nurses who are responsible to dispense medicines. And they have to dispense them exactly according to the instructions of the physician. But you can imagine how many different medications they're dispensing every day, and some are pills, and some are injections, and some are through an IV, and some is transdermal, and some is a suppository, and some is through the nose, and very detailed. And even if the nurses only make a few mistakes, those mistakes can be catastrophic for those patients. So there was some observation, well, what was the problem? And they found that the problem most often occurred when the nurses were interrupted while they were dispensing medicine. They would get interrupted mostly by a doctor and sometimes by other nurses, and then they would get confused. So they had the idea, why don't we have the nurses wear a vest that says, I'm dispensing medicine, don't interrupt me. So in one hospital ward, they trialed this, and the nurses hated it. They said, everyone's going to think we're incompetent, that we need to wear a vest. And the doctors hated it because they weren't allowed to interrupt the nurses while they were wearing these vests. There was just protest, 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 protest. At the end of the month, they found out that the medical errors had gone almost to zero. At which point, everybody embraced the change. Here's another example. Here you see a sign telling you you should be safe. And here you see machines that force you to use two hands in order to operate the machine. So they rig the machine that you have to press two buttons simultaneously, which are far enough apart from each other that you have to use both hands. So what's going to be more effective at preventing accidents? A sign that tells you you're responsible? Or a machine that makes it impossible for you to make a mistake? You have the story of an executive who was told by the people that she managed that they felt she wasn't attentive enough to them when she met with them. So she reconfigured her office and put in sofas and chairs, and whenever she met with anyone, she got back from behind her desk and sat with them there, so they simply felt that she was more present, and the complaints went down to zero. I'm sure we've all had experience of trying to reach a company and getting one of those machine loops, right? Press this, press this, press this, press this, press this. So there was a company that actually had a policy of not answering customer requests, just having them go through this loop, until they finally got a detailed written complaint from a customer who had been trying for months to contact someone at the company with something that the manager saw could have been fixed in 5 minutes. So what he did was rather radical. He got rid of the answering system entirely and had the phones ring directly at the desks of the customer service people. It wouldn't go into any kind of hold pattern. They had to answer the phone. Not only did the customers like the company, but soon the company got to the top of its class in terms of profit and in terms of customer satisfaction. So this is the first thing in shaping the path, is tweak the environment. Make a physical change. You know, even in our own lives, sometimes it's just that simple for something we're trying to change in ourselves. Sometimes it's just as simple as moving a chair, putting your altar in a different place, locking up your phone until 8 in the morning. Something where you just tweak the physical environment. That one little change in the physical environment is enough to change everything. And this can be true again, even with something you think is very major. You know, if you think about customer service, it wasn't a question that you had to re-educate everyone in the company and do all this training. You simply set it up so that they were forced to answer the phone. Okay, let's look at habits. This is another way of shaping the path. As we said, most of the time when we're trying to make a change, we're trying to change an existing habit to something else. So one way you can do is you can piggyback your change onto an existing behavior. It's called an action trigger. Like you can say, all right, I'm going to listen to an audiobook whenever I take prasadam. You take something that's already a habit and you add something onto it. Something that's already a habit and you add something onto it. Like let's say you wanted to train the devotees to greet guests in a temple. I don't know if you're familiar, there's a gentleman, Peter Burwash, very, very famous, wealthy person who's a devotee, never got initiated, but he's very much a devotee. And every year he calls temples and keeps a record of how they answer the phone. And then he gives a report. He does this in North America. He gives us a report to the North American leaders about how they answer the phone. He also travels a lot for his business and his preaching. Srila Prabhupada gave him a preaching mission in terms of vegetarianism. And as he travels the world, he visits ISKCON temples, and he visits dressed in regular Western clothing. And although he's a very famous person, he doesn't have an immediately recognizable face to most devotees. And he keeps a record of how he's greeted at various temples. And I've heard his reports many years. Most temples he's completely ignored. Like completely. Nobody says hello, Haribo, anything. He says devotee after devotee will walk by, Hare Krishna, and not talk to him. And, he makes reports. So if we were going to get devotees to greet guests, can you think of some existing habit that people do in the temple room that you could just tag that onto? Yeah.
Well, when we meet a new devotee, generally there's some interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that can be linked to, if you meet a soul in a human body, then greet him. Just like you said about the children, I just had an experience.
Mm-hmm.
We mentioned in the morning about the children. I went out and I saw a kid. He said, "Hey, nice to see you." I just smiled. Generally, I wouldn't do that.
Right. Okay. Okay. Some other suggestion, just some existing habit that you could tie it to. Yeah.
I'm just trying to think. So, thinking perhaps if a devotee's on their way into the program, and while they're on their way into the program, if they happen to spot a face that they don't recognize, they could possibly ask them if they're new around there.
Okay.
That doesn't interfere with their habit too much, but it still can allow.
Okay, so generally when we go into a temple room, we ring the bell or we knock on the door. And if you train people, right after you ring that bell and knock on the door, look around and see if there's someone you don't recognize, right? Or maybe right after you get up from offering obeisances. I mean, I had the experience at a temple which shall not be named, where I was going every morning as a visitor for 10 days, and I was very obviously a visitor just by my physical appearance, where not one single person said anything to me. And it was a very small temple, 15, 20 people were there at Mangal Artik. Nobody even said Hari Bol. On the 10th day, the temple president's wife comes up to me and says, "We need you to make garlands." Not even a, "What is your name? Hari Bol, nice to have you here." I was just kind of shocked. And there's also a gentleman who I've met, very interesting person. He's a leader in the Roman Catholic world. He's a Franciscan monk, and he travels the world speaking about Christianity, sometimes to crowds of 100,000 people. He's authored books. And he's a secret Hare Krishna. So he's chanting 16 rounds, following the principles, reading the books, and so forth. And he was telling me that he almost didn't join ISKCON. He said he came to 5 different temples, and nobody said hello. He was completely and totally ignored. He said on the 5th try, he was in Alachua, and he came to Mangal Artik. He stayed overnight, came to Mangal Artik. And he said he finally got to the point, he said, "I give up. I guess this society isn't for me." And as he was walking out of the temple room door, my god sister Nanda saw him, crossed from the ladies' side over to the men's side and said, "Excuse me, are you new here?" So if you think about if we wanted to change how guests were received, we could just simply ask devotees, as soon as you get up from offering obeisances in the temple room, look around, is there an unfamiliar face? Or we could say, right after Tulsi worship, or here, right after the announcements, look around, see if there's somebody unfamiliar, find at least one person, "Oh, Hari Bol, welcome." So you could tag it on to an existing behavior. This is a very good way to make a change just in the environment. Now, action triggers have to be very specific and very visible. Like you could say to people, after you drop your kids off at the school bus, and you sit in your car, why don't you meditate for 5 minutes? Have that as a meditation time. An action trigger is where you link a new habit to an existing habit, and the existing habit needs to be very visible, very specific, and very obvious. You all follow that? Okay. Who brought up about going to the gym? There was somebody over here. You did. Okay, and I told you we would get to that, right? So here's the going to the gym. So if you're thinking, all right, I want to exercise today, so you can write down when, where, and what exercise you're going to do. as a way of building a habit, to be specific. See, if you're trying to exercise more and you just say, I'm going to go to the gym, if you just change the words, I'm going to exercise more, with I'm going to the gym, you're just renaming the same problem. Do you understand that? I'm going to exercise more and I'm going to the gym is not building a habit. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. So a way you could build a habit would be to put out your exercise clothes at night for the morning, to ask a friend to pick you up, some kind of a trigger. Now, any habit that you build in has to be advancing your mission in general. So it has to be advancing the big change that you want to make. And it also has to be relatively easy to do. If you want people to build in a new habit, it needs to be something simple, like, oh, Hare Krishna, are you new here? You know, not something like you have to carry halva around in your bag and, you know, a Bhagavatam set. And, you know, it has to be something that's relatively simple, and it has to be that people can understand how it's related to your overall mission. Okay, another way of building habits is with a checklist. So checklists are done, say, like by airline pilots, people who want to pack and not lose things. But if you want to make some change in an organization and you want to do it by shaping the path, one way you can do it is by giving people checklists for certain behaviors. Does this make sense? Okay. All right, and the last thing in shaping the path is called rally the herd. We are social beings, and we tend to do what other people around us are doing. Now, this is kind of a diabolical experiment, but it's very psychologically telling. So, volunteers for experiments were put in a room, and they were told to wait for the interviewer to come in. And while they were waiting alone, smoke was pumped into the room. Okay, of the people waiting alone, 75% got up and tried to alert somebody to the fact that smoke was coming in the room. Then also what they did was they would have some volunteers waiting for the interviewer, and they had other people that were part of the research waiting in the room with them. You all following that? Everybody understand? So you put your subject, your volunteer in the room, and there's another 3 people in the room that person thinks are volunteers, but they're actually part of the experiment. They're all supposedly waiting for the interviewer. Then they pump smoke into the room, and the other people who are really part of the experiment don't react to the smoke. They just go on reading or sitting. The actual volunteer, in that case, only 38% would do anything. Because we're thinking, if they're not doing anything, I shouldn't do anything either. You know, if we're in some crowded place and somebody falls down and lies on the ground, do we help them or not? We often look around and see, what are other people doing, before we decide what we're going to do. Things like smoking and obesity are contagious even over geographical distances. Even if your friends who live thousands of miles away get fat, you are more likely to become fat. Because you'll change your idea of acceptable body type by what they look like. Obesity, divorce is also very contagious. So there's a number of behaviors that are contagious. If we think, oh, that's acceptable, they're doing it, it must be okay, then we tend to do it. You know, we talk about peer pressure, but this is just peer perception. It's not that your obese friends pressure you to become obese. You follow? But just you feel more relaxed. Well, they're overweight and it's fine. So, if I eat an extra 2 pieces of cake, I'll just be normal. Is that clear? So you can use this principle in order to shape your path and be a change agent. Let's say that 80% of the people in your group turn in their reports on time. You can publicize it. But if only 20% do, then don't publicize it. If you say, only 20% of you have turned in your reports, then the rest are going to say, well, that's normal behavior, and that's what I should do. Now, perhaps some of you have heard the word designated driver. Who's heard of the term designated driver? Okay, what that means is if people are together drinking alcohol and they need to drive after drinking, one of them doesn't drink. And the one who doesn't drink will drive everybody else. So this term has become very common in the world. It didn't used to be. What happened is a particular man got the idea that there should be a concept and a behavior of a designated driver, that it would save lives. Right? Make sense? All right, so what did he do? He went to movie producers and television producers, and he said, would you give me 5 seconds of your show that would save hundreds of thousands of lives? Sure. He said, whenever you have a scene where people are drinking alcohol and some of them will have to drive, put in the words, who is the designated driver? Or just put in the words, designated driver. Just from that, it became a general household term and a general practice. Interesting, isn't it? This is also a quite interesting. Maybe some of you are familiar with the concept of sugar daddies and sugar babies. Are you familiar with this concept? This is where older men who may even be married, they take on a young woman as a kind of prostitute. They have relations with her and they pay her, but it's like a longish term sort of relationship. She becomes like a mistress. This is often done in the West with girls who are in college, where the older man will say, I'll pay your college tuition and things of this nature. So this situation was a really big problem in Tanzania. And it was particularly a problem in Tanzania because the young girls were often getting AIDS, and they were often having children by these older men, at which point they were ostracized by society. But because the women were very poor, they tended to go for these relationships. Now, in general in Tanzania, people looked down on this sort of behavior, but people didn't vocalize it. They didn't talk about it. So what was done was creating radio shows of some old man who was trying to coerce a young woman in this sort of relationship, but kept getting stopped by other people, that other people would interfere and say to the girl, hey, don't do this, get out of here, they would do something to stop them. And so the older man was always foiled. And the older man was called, I think, Fatazi, which means like an idiot. And so gradually, after some time of these radio shows, and in Tanzania, radio shows were very popular, the word Fatazi ended up in the vocabulary of the country to refer to men who had this behavior. It ended up in the newspapers. It ended up in people's conversations. And people started to feel comfortable to speak up and interfere when they saw these kind of relationships happening. And the hospitals and clinics started seeing a huge reduction in the cases of AIDS and illegitimate pregnancy of these young women. So this is also shaping the path by rallying the herd, creating some sort of a norm within the culture. Now, if you want to change the culture of an organization, also another way to rally the herd, and I think we're doing this here, is to get the reformers together and find a free space for them to congregate. So if you're trying to get a reform, have a place where your reformers can come and talk together outside of the purview of the organization in general. Now, what this will do was temporarily create a kind of identity conflict. For at least a while, it'll be sort of a us versus them, you know, the way things have been, and the people who want to make a reform. However, this is one way gradually to get more and more of people on board with the reform and to make a change. This actually happened in ISKCON as a change from the zonal Acharya days with the 50-man committee, if you want to review ISKCON history. Okay, so looking at the 3 areas for shaping the path, we have tweaking the environment, like providing smaller plates, automating systems, identifying and removing bottlenecks and difficulties, building habits with action triggers, piggybacking on an old habit and using checklists, rallying the herd. We have social pressure. If you have a majority, publicize it. If not, don't. And create a free space for reformer. Okay, looking again, directing the writer for clarity, directing the rational, analytical mind, motivating the emotional mind for desire, and shaping the path for ease. Keep in mind that change is usually baby steps. Change doesn't usually happen overnight. As we talked about dealing with the elephant, that you prepare people. When you grow your people, you prepare them for failure. As the change agent, prepare yourself for failure. Prepare yourself that there's baby steps, there's steps back. I know myself in trying to make big changes and big initiatives that I've had situations and, okay, there's my destination, I'm going that way, and I got this great door that opened and I'm going this way, and then there's a wall, and I think, why did Krishna open the door back here if there was just going to be a wall? But when I get here where there's a wall, all of a sudden I see that there's a corridor that I couldn't have seen from here. Many times what appears to be failure and difficulty is really Krishna taking us to a place that we wouldn't have been willing to go initially because we really didn't understand. Okay, I hope you liked this presentation. I hope you found it helpful. I now would like to show a video that the authors of this book gave me. I told them I was going to be presenting this at the Leadership Academy here, and I asked them if I could have it offline, thankfully, because the internet here is not exactly the best in the universe. So I'm going to show you now a 16-minute video that summarizes some of the main points, and then after that we'll take a little break. Then after that we'll make sure we have all the paper. During the break we'll make sure we have all the papers passed out. Yes, and you'll have your devices with your electronic files. And then we're going to go through 6 scenarios where the authors have given a problem and then they've given their solutions. And what we're going to do is look at the problem, try to think of our own solutions, and then look at their solutions. Okay? I'm just reminding you that starting tomorrow morning, you're going to bring your own desire for change. Yes? Yes? And then we're going to be working on that through 3 whole sessions. Yes?
This desire for change in this play, it's also for oneself. It could be for oneself, or it has to be in a group or in society.
It's up to you. Don't have it too easy. Okay, can we get the lights again? I mean, my understanding is that all of you are here because you want to change society, not just your own stuff. Right? You didn't come here just to, like, chant Better Japa or something. We had a great holy name retreat out at Govardhan a few weeks ago. So my understanding is that you're here not just to make some change in your own life or the life of your family, but you're thinking a little bit bigger than that. obviously you can use this to make changes in yourself, and you can use this to make changes in people that you know. If you want to bring something like that, you could, but I would really suggest that you think big, at least a little bit bigger than that. Okay, I don't think you should come tomorrow morning with a plan to make the whole universe Krishna conscious. I know that's in Prabhupada's purports. I know Prabhupada talks about spreading this movement to other planets. He does. And whenever I read that, I think, spaceships? I don't suggest you bring something like that, but I do suggest you bring something that you really care about. Something that you care about, okay? And maybe if you don't already have something in mind, maybe think about that tonight and pray about that tonight, what you could bring. And you could even, if you want, you could bring more than one thing, and if you try playing around with one thing and you're not getting anywhere, then you could use your backup, all right? But you're really going to have nothing to do for the next, for that like day and a half if you don't have something to work on, all right?
My brother Chip and I wrote a book called Switch that's about how to lead change. And it's a long book. It's got a 3-part framework, and underneath each of those parts there are 3 sub-tools.
Huh?
Probably take you 6 hours.
It's already as loud as it goes. It's only speaking
Gist,
like that.
the basics of Switch as quickly as I can in this video. So the starting point is this. If you think about any change, whether you're talking about something personal like a diet or an exercise plan or something organizational, even something societal, getting people to recycle, for instance, if you follow all those changes through, inevitably you're going to hit behavior change. And our thesis is that for something to change, somebody somewhere has to start behaving differently. In other words, all change is ultimately behavior change. That's the 50,000-foot view. Now, just underneath that, if we're going to talk about behavior change, we need to understand one of the most fundamental tensions of psychology. And I think I can bring those tensions to life just by asking you some questions. So let me start with, did you set an alarm to wake up this morning? If so, did you hit snooze? Twice? 3 times? 4 times? Have you ever been on a diet? Did you have fun on the diet? Have you ever been on a diet and then quit before you realized your goals? Do you go to the gym as much as you think would be scientifically worthy? One more question for you. Are you engaged right now in some kind of habit? Maybe it's something you eat or drink, or maybe it's a illicit substance. Maybe it's a pattern of behavior like procrastination. Maybe it's a relationship where the relationship isn't quite good for you. But across these things, what I'm asking for is, are you doing something in life right now where you have all the information that you need to know it's not a good idea for you, and yet you keep doing it anyway? My guess is, if you're like the entirety of the human species, the answer to that was yes. And if it wasn't yes, let us know, because psychology wants to study you. What we're seeing across these situations, snooze button on the alarm, diets, exercise plans, people breaking budgets, people engaged in habits they know to be bad for them, is that there's this distinction between knowing what the right answer is and doing it. And in fact, psychologists have a good explanation for this. They say that in our brains we have 2 systems, not 1 but 2. One called the rational system, and that's the part of us that thinks up all these good ideas, the budgets, the diets, and so forth. But the second system is called the emotional system. That's the part of us that runs our autopilot behaviors, and the part of us that craves, that desires, that, having just proclaimed ourselves on a diet, we find ourselves in line at Cinnabon. And this tension is a familiar one, that we have these 2 systems in our brain that really fight for supremacy. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has a great analogy for these 2 systems. He says that the emotional system is like a big elephant in our heads, and on its back is a little human-scale rider that represents the rational part of us, the enlightened part. And of course, the funny thing about this picture is the scale difference, that you can see if these 2 ever get in a tug of war, who would you put your money on? Now, this tells you why a diet is hard, because you've got this well-intentioned little guy trying to rein in a 5-ton beast. But it also tells you why organizational change, why societal change is hard. Because in times of change, what do we try to do? We try to tell people things, right? We show them the business case. We show them the charts, the data, the graphs, the supporting memo, the bullet points. And with all of that stuff, who are we talking to in the picture? Talking to the little guy, right? And meanwhile, we've forgotten that no change can happen without getting the elephant on board. So that's the basic context you need to make sense of the core 3-part framework that is the heart of the book Switch. And it starts with the need to direct the rider, that rational system, to show people exactly where we need to go and how to get there. It's the GPS directions. The second is the need to motivate the elephant, to appeal to emotion, to get people excited about the journey. And that is the piece that's all too frequently forgotten in change efforts. And then the third part, which I haven't really talked about yet, is the need to shape the path for change. And that means if you want people to go on a journey from point A to point B, try to get all the obstacles out of the way, and it sure helps if that road slopes downhill. All right, so that's the gist. That's the heart of Switch, this 3-part framework. If you get lost, by the way, in this language, which one's the rider and which one's the elephant again, I want to map these to their goals. So in directing the rider, what we're trying to achieve is clarity. We want clarity of change. What are we expecting people to do? When we motivate the elephant, what we're trying to do is create desire. Why do people want to go there? What's exciting about it? What's challenging about it? And finally, if we want to shape the path, the outcome there that we want is ease. Can we simply make it a little bit easier for people to make the change we're contemplating? Now I want to give you 3 examples in kind of increasing order of complexity that show off how to use this framework in real-world situations. So here we go. Situation 1. A mother. This is a true story, by the way. We got an email from a mother who said that she had a son who loved to play with trucks. What he did not love to do was clean up the trucks afterwards. And so, she'd been after him and pestering him to clean up his room and get things tidied up. And, like all children, he didn't really want to do that. And so she wrote us to say that after she'd read Switch, she came up with a breakthrough. So let's run the plan here. We have a behavior change issue, which means we have an audience, this little boy, and a goal to clean up his room. Now we can put those goals and that audience into the Switch framework. The first thing we have to ask ourselves is, let's start in the middle in this case. How can we increase the boy's desire? How can we motivate his elephant to clean up the room? Well, 9 people out of 10, when you give them that question, they're going to say, you bribe him, right? You give him a little piece of candy if he cleans up his room. But resist that urge for a second, because so many times we're going to find that incentives are actually the last resort rather than the first resort. And in this case, this boy's mother did something brilliant. She said, forget about cleaning up your room. What you should really do when you're done playing with your trucks is you should park them. And he thought, well, that sounds pretty cool. And so she took this old bookshelf and she took all the books off the shelf and she painted. My brother Chip and I wrote a book called Switch that's about how to lead change. Second, because so many times we're going to find that incentives are actually the...
Why does it... I'm just going to remove that. I don't know why. Sorry.
Is the video online?
It's only, you have to be registered.
My brother Chip and I wrote a book called Switch that's about how to lead change, motivate the elephant to appeal of change. What are we expecting? Things tidied up and, like all children, he didn't really want to do. Let's start in the middle in this case. And he thought, well, that sounds pretty cool. And so she took this old bookshelf and she took all the books off the shelf and she painted.
I'm online, it's just the connection isn't great.
I connect to my hotspot.
What are you using in there? What's the lot better than Geo here? Okay, why don't you take a break now? Take a break. 15 minutes. Come back at 1:45. We'll try to sort this out. So you think I incompletely downloaded it, huh?
Yeah. Slight error with the video.
I never actually checked it out. One second, let me just find it again.
Yeah. But the VCD player was not the loudest.
That's the loudest. Oh, the actual VLC.
There's more.
After 100, it starts distorting. I mean, 125 when it starts. My way.
We don't need to download, we just need to play it. We have a good internet connection.
By when do you want the handouts?
Yeah, we want anything that says clinic on it.
I see. You don't want this switch the organization one?
That's for tomorrow.
Okay.
I also want the one that says